A man once trusted to guard a nation's gates is led away in silence, while a country holds its breath. This is not merely the arrest of a former leader, it is the unmasking of a fracture that runs deep through the soil of a young revolution. On one side stands a promise of sovereignty, dignity, and a future wrestled back from dependency. On the other, the old reflexes of power, exile, intrigue, and the politics of shadows reach out from beyond the border. In the early days of January, as rumors of a failed coup and an attempted assassination spread through the Sahel, the story appeared simple. Yet simplicity dissolves quickly in times like these. A quiet villa in Lomé, a court decision whispered before it is spoken aloud, a flight whose destination is not announced. Each detail feels small, but together they form a question too heavy to ignore. Was this the closing of a chapter, or the opening of a far more dangerous one? Because when a nation fighting to reclaim its voice confronts betrayal from within, the issue is no longer about one man. It becomes a test of justice, restraint, and resolve. It asks whether a revolution can defend itself without becoming the very thing it once resisted. Stay with us. This is more than a breaking update. It is a hinge in history. Subscribe and walk with this story as it unfolds. Revolutions rarely collapse with a single blow. More often they are tested by quiet betrayals, by familiar faces who know the corridors of power too well. The events that unfolded in early January belong firmly to that pattern. The timeline begins not in January, but years earlier. Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba once stood at the center of Burkina Faso's military and political life. He rose as a soldier tasked with confronting insurgency and restoring order. In September 2022, that chapter ended abruptly. He was removed from power by a younger officer, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, amid widespread frustration over security failures and the growing human cost of instability. Damiba fled the country and resurfaced in neighboring Togo, where he would remain for more than 2 years, officially in exile, unofficially in political limbo. For a time, his name faded from the headlines. But exile does not always mean irrelevance. According to Burkinabe authorities, the calm was deceptive. On January 3rd, security services announced they had disrupted what they described as an attempted coup combined with an assassination plot targeting the head of state. The allegation was stark. This was not a spontaneous mutiny, but a coordinated operation involving military insiders, regional intermediaries, and external financing. At the center of the accusation stood a familiar figure, the former leader himself. What followed moved quickly, yet almost entirely out of public view. On January 16th, Damiba was reportedly taken from the residence where he had been living in Lomé. He was brought before the Court of Appeal, where judges reviewed an extradition request submitted by the government of Burkina Faso. Within days, the request was approved. By January 17th, he was escorted to the airport and placed on a flight. His destination was not announced. No press conference was held. No joint statement was issued. The official silence was as striking as the action itself. This silence became part of the story. For years, conflicting accounts had circulated about Damiba's status in Togo. Some sources claimed he lived under close surveillance, his movements restricted, his compound heavily guarded. Others suggested these descriptions were exaggerated, pointing out that exile in name does not always equate to confinement in practice. The January events forced a reckoning with those contradictions. If he had indeed been monitored, how could he have coordinated a plot of such scale? If he had not, why had the narrative of constant surveillance been allowed to persist? Authorities in Burkina Faso framed the arrest and extradition as a necessary step in defending national security. According to their account, the January 3rd plot was not an isolated incident, but part of a longer pattern of destabilization attempts since the change of leadership. They alleged links between the conspirators and armed extremist groups operating in the Sahel, as well as the movement of funds across borders to finance the operation. These claims, while serious, remain allegations until tested through legal proceedings. Yet even as allegations, they carried immense symbolic weight. The symbolism was unavoidable. A man who once commanded the state security apparatus was now accused of conspiring against it. The soil he once claimed to defend had, in the official narrative, become collateral in a personal struggle for power. The extradition itself revealed another layer of complexity. Reports indicated that approval was granted under conditions, specifically assurances regarding Damiba's treatment and the penalties he might face. This detail, barely mentioned in public discourse, mattered deeply. It drew a line between justice and vengeance, between the rule of law and the raw anger that follows betrayal. In moments like these, how a state treats its former rulers sends a message not only to its citizens, but to the region and the world. For ordinary people in Burkina Faso, the news landed with mixed emotions. Relief that a perceived threat had been removed. Unease that the threat had existed at all. And beneath both, a quieter question. How many other plots had been imagined, attempted, or narrowly avoided since the country chose a new path? This was no longer just about one man in exile. It was about the vulnerability of a nation in transition. About how fragile sovereignty can be when old networks, old loyalties and old ambitions refuse to die quietly. The road ahead, already uneven, now revealed hidden cracks beneath its surface. And as the plane carrying Damiba disappeared into the sky, another question settled heavily over the Sahel. If this chapter has truly closed, why does it feel like the story is only just beginning? Every political drama has a moment when facts collide with logic. In this story, that collision came with a question so simple it unsettled everything that followed. How does a man under watch orchestrate a plot of such reach? As news of the extradition spread, attention shifted from the act itself to the circumstances that made it possible. Accounts emerging from Lomé described a former leader living in a fortified compound, in a neighborhood known for discretion rather than freedom. Security, it was said, was constant. Movements were limited. Visitors were noted. The image presented was not of a free exile, but of a man tolerated under supervision. And yet, authorities in Burkina Faso alleged that this same man had helped coordinate an attempted coup and an assassination plot across borders. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If surveillance was real and effective, the planning of such an operation should have been detected. If it was not detected, then surveillance was either porous or performative. This was the moment the story reached its emotional peak. Public reaction followed two distinct currents. The first was visceral and immediate. Many saw the arrest as vindication, proof that the state was learning to defend itself after years of vulnerability. In markets, on radio phone-ins and across social media, the dominant sentiment was relief laced with anger. Betrayal in political life is rarely forgiven, especially when it is framed as collaboration with forces that have already inflicted deep civilian suffering. The second current was quieter but no less powerful. It was skepticism. Commentators, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike began asking uncomfortable questions. Who knew what and when? How far did the network extend? If planning occurred across multiple countries, were all parties equally unaware? The silence from official channels, both in Lomé and in Ouagadougou, only intensified these doubts. Each day without a statement allowed speculation to harden into narrative. Internationally, reactions were cautious. Neighboring states watched closely, aware that today's extradition could become tomorrow's precedent. Regional organizations, already strained by shifting alliances and security crises, avoided definitive language. Diplomacy in moments like this prefers ambiguity. It buys time even as it fuels uncertainty. Media framing reflected these tensions. Pan-African outlets emphasized sovereignty and self-defense, casting the extradition as a necessary measure against destabilization. Others highlighted legal process, stressing conditions reportedly attached to the transfer and the importance of avoiding extrajudicial outcomes. The same event was thus read through two lenses, one of revolutionary urgency, the other of institutional restraint. At the center of the storm remained the unresolved puzzle of oversight. Was the narrative of constant monitoring overstated? Or was it accurate, pointing instead to gaps, complicity, or selective blindness? No evidence publicly resolved this dilemma. Authorities spoke of ongoing investigations. Sources spoke of record. The public was left to connect fragments, knowing that fragments can mislead as easily as they inform. The emotional temperature rose further as discussions turned to accountability. If the allegations were proven, what punishment would be just? Some voices demanded the harshest response, arguing that mercy toward betrayal invites repetition. Others warned that vengeance, however emotionally satisfying, risks corroding the moral foundation of a state that claims to stand for renewal and dignity. This debate revealed something deeper than disagreement over policy. It exposed a society negotiating its identity under pressure. After years of coups that succeeded with alarming ease, the failure of recent plots suggested change. Intelligence appeared sharper, security tighter. Yet the very existence of such plots showed how contested the path forward remained. For supporters of the current order, the episode became a rallying point, evidence that enemies of change were desperate, reduced to conspiracies rather than commands. For critics, it was a warning. Concentration of power and prolonged emergency measures carry their own dangers, even when justified by security threats. In this sense, the arrest and extradition did not resolve a crisis. They transformed it. What began as an alleged conspiracy evolved into a national conversation about vigilance, law, and the limits of trust. The story was no longer confined to January 3rd. It now asked how a state under siege balances firmness with fairness, secrecy with transparency. And as officials promised clarity in due time, another question lingered, heavier than before. If this plot was uncovered only at the last moment, how many others remain hidden in the silence between borders? The immediate aftermath of the January revelations did not unfold in courtrooms alone. It unfolded in daily life, in conversations held quietly, and in judgments formed without official transcripts. When allegations of an attempted coup and assassination surface, the first casualty is not always stability, it is certainty. In the short term, the state moved to consolidate control. Security protocols were tightened, military units were reshuffled. Intelligence coordination became more centralized, less tolerant of ambiguity. For many citizens, these measures brought a sense of reassurance. After years marked by sudden seizures of power, the visible failure of recent plots suggested that the balance had shifted. The gates, once easily breached, appeared more firmly guarded. Yet reassurance came with a cost. Heightened security reshaped routines. Increased checkpoints slowed movement. Surveillance became more visible, and with visibility came unease. In societies emerging from repeated political ruptures, vigilance and suspicion often travel together. The line between protection and pressure is thin, and people sense it instinctively. When security becomes permanent rather than provisional, it begins to define the political climate. Economically, uncertainty lingered. Investors, both domestic and regional, watched closely. Political risk does not need to materialize to affect decisions. It only needs to feel plausible. The suggestion of cross-border financing, alleged intermediaries, and regional entanglements reinforced perceptions of fragility. Even without confirmed verdicts, the narrative of persistent threat shaped expectations. Markets hesitated. Long-term planning paused. Socially, the episode reopened old wounds. Burkina Faso has lived through rapid transitions before, each leaving behind questions of legitimacy and loyalty. The accusation that a former head of state could conspire against the nation touched a raw nerve. It blurred distinctions between past and present, between defeated orders and unfinished business. Trust, once eroded, does not return easily. Politically, the implications were sharper still. The current leadership framed the disrupted plot as evidence of necessity, proof that extraordinary times demand extraordinary measures. Supporters echoed this view, arguing that reforms and security consolidation required time free from electoral turbulence. Critics, however, worried aloud that prolonged emergency logic risks becoming permanent governance. This tension defined the civic debate. At its heart lay a fundamental question. How does a state secure itself without hollowing out the consent that gives it meaning? The answer is neither simple nor abstract. It is lived through policy choices, communication strategies, and the treatment of opponents. The way allegations are investigated, the transparency of proceedings, and the restraint shown in punishment all contribute to the answer. The figure at the center of these debates was unavoidable. For many citizens, Ibrahim Traoré symbolized the break with the inertia of the past, a leader shaped by battlefield realities rather than ceremonial politics. His survival through repeated alleged plots strengthened his image among supporters as both resilient and necessary. At the same time, it intensified scrutiny. Survival invites expectation. Each thwarted attempt raised the stakes, transforming personal security into a measure of national direction. In the medium term, the political order faced a paradox. The apparent difficulty of organizing coups signaled increased institutional strength. Intelligence investments and operational coordination appeared to be working. Yet the persistence of attempts, however fragmented, suggested unresolved grievances. Security can suppress symptoms, but it cannot by itself heal divisions rooted in history, inequality, and competing visions of legitimacy. Civil society organizations navigated this space cautiously. Many shared the desire for stability, wary of chaos that would erase fragile gains. At the same time, they pushed, sometimes quietly, for legal clarity and proportional response. The fear was not of justice, but of precedent. What is justified during crisis can become habit during calm. The episode also reshaped political imagination. For a generation accustomed to abrupt change, the failure of recent plots hinted at continuity, a rare commodity in recent memory. Continuity allows planning. It allows institutions to mature. But continuity without accountability risks stagnation. The balance between the two remains the defining challenge. As conversations spread, from urban centers to rural communities, from formal forums to private gatherings, one question returned again and again, phrased differently but carrying the same weight. How much power should a state hold in order to protect itself? And who decides when that power has gone too far? The answer, still forming, would not only determine the fate of those accused, it would shape the character of governance in the years ahead. And as the nation weighed security against openness, another uncertainty loomed beyond its borders, one that would soon pull this domestic reckoning onto a wider stage. What unfolded in January did not remain a domestic affair for long. In a region where borders are porous and alliances fluid, every security shock sends ripples outward. Neighboring capitals watched closely, not because they wished to intervene, but because the implications were impossible to ignore. For regional organizations, the moment was awkward. Years of political upheaval across the Sahel have strained mechanisms designed for stability rather than rupture. Statements, when they came, were careful, measured language emphasizing dialogue, legality, and restraint. Silence in this context functioned as diplomacy. It avoided confrontation while acknowledging uncertainty. No actor wanted to set a precedent that might one day be used against them. Neighboring states faced their own calculations. Cooperation on extradition signaled a willingness to prioritize state-to-state relations over personal loyalties. At the same time, it exposed vulnerabilities shared across borders. Exiled figures, financial networks, and informal intermediaries do not respect jurisdictional lines. What happens in one capital rarely stays there. The Sahel's security dilemma is collective, even when responses remain national. Beyond the region, international reactions were framed by familiar concerns. Stability mattered, legal process mattered, and above all, predictability mattered. For external partners, the question was less about personalities and more about trajectory. Would the current path lead to consolidated authority capable of delivering security, or to prolonged emergency governance that alienates allies and investors alike? Media narratives reflected this ambivalence. Some outlets portrayed events as further evidence of a volatile region struggling to escape a cycle of coups. Others highlighted the apparent hardening of state capacity, noting that recent plots had failed where earlier ones succeeded. The same facts supported opposing conclusions, depending on which lens was applied. Within this global conversation, Burkina Faso occupied a delicate position. Its leadership argued that sovereignty required the freedom to choose partners, priorities, and pace. That argument resonated in parts of the global south, where frustration with conditional engagement runs deep. Yet it also raised questions among traditional partners accustomed to predictable frameworks and timelines. Legal considerations added another layer. Extradition under conditions underscored the importance of international norms, even in moments of crisis. The message was subtle but significant. Cooperation does not erase obligations. Justice, to be recognized beyond borders, must be seen to respect procedure as well as outcome. For observers in Washington, Brussels, and beyond, the situation illustrated a broader dilemma. Supporting stability without endorsing repression is easier in theory than in practice. Criticizing governance choices risks pushing states further away. Silence risks complicity. In this space, statements become calibrated instruments, designed to signal concern without closing doors. As the story circulated globally, it became a case study rather than an anomaly. Analysts spoke of shifting alignments, of the erosion of old certainties, of a Sahel redefining its place in the world. The events of January were woven into that narrative, not as a standalone crisis, but as another thread in a larger tapestry of transformation. At the center of these debates stood Burkina Faso, not as an abstraction, but as a testing ground. The way it navigated accusation, extradition, and accountability would inform how others interpreted the region's future. Would it emerge as an example of firm yet restrained sovereignty, or as another warning tale of power hardening under pressure? As international attention lingered, one thing became clear. The next steps would be judged not only at home, but far beyond the Sahel. And the choices made in the name of security would echo in diplomatic halls long after headlines moved on. Yet even as the world assessed implications and interests, the most difficult decisions still lay ahead. Decisions not about reaction, but about direction. Moments of crisis have a way of narrowing choices, reducing the future to a question of force versus fragility. Yet the path ahead is rarely so stark. What lies before the Sahel now is not a single road, but a fork shaped by restraint, foresight, and the patience to build what force alone cannot secure. One possible future is defined by consolidation. In this scenario, heightened security becomes a bridge rather than a destination. Intelligence reforms mature into institutions. Military readiness evolves into deterrence rather than dominance. Legal processes, however slow, are allowed to run their course, signaling that stability does not require the abandonment of principle. This path demands discipline. It asks leaders to resist the temptation of shortcuts, even when public anger clamors for them. Another future is more brittle. Emergency measures harden into permanent rule. Secrecy replaces accountability. Stability is pursued through control rather than consent. In the short term, this approach can appear effective. Plots are deterred, dissent quieted. Over time, however, it risks isolating the state from its own society, turning vigilance inward and breeding the very resentment it seeks to suppress. Between these extremes lies the most difficult terrain: transition. Building sovereignty while remaining open, defending the state without silencing the people. Choosing trade over aid not as a slogan, but as a structural shift, moving from extraction to value, from dependency to partnership. This work is slow, unglamorous, and easily overshadowed by security headlines. Yet it is here, in policy details and institutional habits, that revolutions either take root or wither. Security will remain central. The region's challenges do not vanish with a single disrupted plot. Armed groups persist. Borders remain porous. External interests continue to compete. No responsible leadership can afford complacency. But security that crowds out development and dialogue becomes a seed planted in barren soil. The question then is not whether force is necessary. It is how force is framed, whether as a shield protecting growth or as a wall blocking it. Signals from recent months suggest an awareness of this balance. Investments in intelligence have been paired with rhetoric emphasizing dignity and independence. Diplomatic engagement, though selective, has not been abandoned. The language of partnership, rather than patronage, has gained prominence. These choices hint at a strategy that sees sovereignty as a process, not a posture. For citizens, the road ahead demands its own form of courage. Supporting stability does not mean surrendering scrutiny. Trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through transparency and consistency. The resilience of any political project rests not only on its leaders, but on the willingness of society to engage critically rather than retreat into silence or cynicism. History offers no guarantees. Revolutions are fragile precisely because they promise more than they can immediately deliver. They unfold in seasons, not moments, through planting, tending, and waiting for harvest. Steel may protect the field, but only seeds create sustenance. As the Sahel stands at this crossroads, the decisive question is not who will be punished or how quickly threats can be neutralized. It is whether the choices made now will nourish a future strong enough to outlast fear. And as this chapter edges toward its close, one final uncertainty hangs in the air. Will the next test come as another plot in the shadows, or as the slow, harder work of proving that sovereignty can endure without losing its soul? What began as a story about one man in exile has revealed something far larger, a nation negotiating the terms of its own becoming. The attempted rupture of January did not simply test security structures. It tested the moral architecture of a political project still under construction. In moments like these, history does not ask whether a state can strike back. It asks whether it can hold itself together. Strength is easy to perform in anger. Restraint is harder and far more revealing. The choices made in response to betrayal echo long after the immediate threat has passed, shaping trust, legitimacy, and the future memory of power. This is why the stakes extend beyond personalities. They reach into how justice is practiced, how dissent is tolerated, and how authority explains itself to the people it claims to serve. A revolution that survives only by force eventually forgets why it began. One that survives by principle learns how to endure. For many supporters, Ibrahim Traoré represents a generation unwilling to accept inherited weakness as destiny. His survival through repeated alleged plots has strengthened the image of resolve and continuity at a time when both are scarce. Yet leadership forged in crisis carries a heavier obligation. Each decision becomes precedent, each silence a signal. The measure of this moment will not be found in punishment alone, but in the clarity and consistency of what follows. The wider context matters just as much. In a region long defined by intervention and dependency, the insistence on choosing partners, paths, and priorities resonates deeply. The idea that sovereignty must be lived, not declared, has transformed political conversation from abstraction into action. But action without reflection risks reproducing the very hierarchies it seeks to escape. Burkina Faso stands at that delicate threshold. The world is watching, but more importantly, its own citizens are listening. Listening for evidence that security can coexist with dignity, that vigilance need not erase accountability, that the promise of renewal does not require the abandonment of restraint. None of this guarantees success. History offers no shortcuts. It rewards patience unevenly and tests conviction relentlessly. Yet moments like this, when pressure exposes character, are precisely when trajectories are set. As this chapter closes, the story remains unfinished. Ibrahim Traoré will face further tests, not only from opponents in the shadows, but from the demands of governance itself. The true verdict will be written not in courtrooms alone, but in whether the coming years deliver safety without silence, authority without fear, and independence that feels lived rather than imposed. If this story speaks to your sense of justice and possibility, do not walk away. Share it, add your voice in the comments, and subscribe to stay with us. History is not only recorded by witnesses, it is shaped by those who choose to pay attention.